What if the first words humanity ever wrote were not meant to announce a beginning at all? What if they were written by people who believed something had already ended, and that what mattered most was preserving what remained? In the wide plains of southern Mesopotamia, where the land stretches flat and quiet beneath an enormous sky, the ruins of ancient cities still sit just beneath the surface. Their walls have collapsed. Their temples have softened into low mounds. Wind and dust move freely across them, reshaping the outlines year after year. And yet beneath that shifting surface, something far more durable waits patiently. Clay tablets pressed by human hands while the mud was still wet, hardened by sun, fire, and time, and left behind as messages from a world that no longer exists. These tablets are covered in small, wedge-shaped impressions, neat and deliberate, arranged into rows that once carried meaning clear enough to guide trade, record law, and preserve memory. We call this writing cuneiform, and it represents the oldest continuous written record humanity has ever recovered. But what makes these tablets remarkable is not simply their age. It is their confidence. They do not read like experiments. They do not feel tentative or unsure. They appear already capable of handling complexity, abstraction, and administration from the very beginning. When archaeologists first uncovered them in the late 19th century, working among the ruins of places like Uruk, Ur, and Nippur, they were not searching for literature or philosophy. They were digging for monuments, for statues, for objects that matched popular ideas of ancient grandeur. Instead, they found rooms filled with clay. Thousands upon thousands of tablets stacked carefully, catalogued, stored with intention. Receipts, inventories, contracts, training exercises for students, hymns, observations of the sky, medical instructions, legal decisions, records of daily life so detailed that individual people emerge from the text, workers receiving rations, students practicing calculations, priests listing offerings, farmers tracking water levels. This was not a civilization just learning how to think. It was a civilization already accustomed to recording thought. And that is where the unease begins. In most places my writing appears, we can trace a gradual evolution. Simple marks become symbols. Symbols slowly acquire sound. Meaning expands over generations. Mistakes accumulate. Systems compete. Some fail and disappear. Others survive and grow more refined. Writing usually leaves behind a trail of false starts and half-formed ideas. But in southern Mesopotamia, the earliest writing we find already works. It can express ownership, obligation, quantity, time, and even metaphor. It can train students. It can transmit law. It can preserve ritual. It is administrative, technical, and flexible from the start. Linguists and archaeologists have long acknowledged this as unusual, even anomalous, but the implications are often softened by familiarity. We repeat that writing emerged here first, and then we move on. Yet the question remains quietly unresolved. How does something like this arrive already functional? The cities associated with these tablets raise the same question. Uruk, often cited as the first true city, grows rapidly into an urban center covering hundreds of hectares. It develops monumental architecture, complex irrigation, specialized labor, and long-distance trade networks within what appears, archaeologically speaking, to be a very short period of time. Its walls stretch for miles. Its temples rise on carefully engineered platforms. Its streets and districts show planning rather than accident. This is not impossible. Human societies are capable of rapid change. But it is unexpected when placed beside other ancient civilizations, where similar complexity emerges gradually, layer by layer, with visible stages of experimentation and refinement. In Mesopotamia, the scaffolding is thin. The finished structure appears early. Mainstream archaeology explains this by pointing to missing evidence. Earlier stages may have existed but were lost to flooding, erosion, or later construction. Rivers change course. Settlements built of mud brick dissolve back into the earth. Time removes far more than it preserves. All of this is true, and any honest investigation must acknowledge it. At the same time, archaeology only studies what survives. Entire coastlines now lie beneath the sea. Vast regions that were once fertile plains are submerged or buried under layers of sediment. If earlier societies existed in places that did not preserve well, their absence from the record tells us very little about whether they lived, organized, or understood the world in sophisticated ways. This tension between what survives and what might have existed sits at the heart of the Sumerian mystery. The people we call the Sumerians did not describe themselves as inventors standing at the dawn of civilization. Their own texts tell a different story. Again and again, phrases appear that suggest continuity rather than creation, restoration rather than invention, preservation rather than discovery. Temples are rebuilt according to ancient designs. Laws are reaffirmed rather than introduced. Kingship is described as something that descends, disappears, and returns, not something forged for the first time. One document in particular brings this worldview into sharp focus. Known today as the Sumerian King List, it survives in several versions copied over centuries. At first glance, it appears to be a simple chronological record, listing cities and the kings who ruled them, along with the lengths of their reigns. But the numbers quickly stretch beyond anything recognizable as human history. Early kings rule for tens of thousands of years. Time is measured in vast units that dwarf normal lifespans. Then, abruptly, the list changes. A flood sweeps over the land. After the flood, kingship is lowered again. Reigns become shorter. Time contracts. The world becomes familiar. For many scholars, the solution is straightforward. The early section is myth. The later section is history. Symbolism gives way to memory. But this neat division struggles to account for the document structure. The list does not announce when it shifts from myth to reality. It does not change tone. It does not become more poetic or more symbolic. It continues calmly, almost bureaucratically, recording name after name, city after city, reign after reign. This raises another possibility, one that the text itself quietly suggests. The numbers may not represent lifespans at all. They may represent something else entirely. Cycles, periods, units of time measured according to systems that later generations preserved without fully understanding. If so, the list becomes less a fairy tale and more a relic, a damaged calendar from a world whose methods no longer survived intact. That interpretation becomes more interesting when placed beside the physical record. At several Mesopotamian sites, including and Shurapak, archaeologists have identified thick layers of clean flood silt separating earlier occupation from later rebuilding. These layers are not the product of seasonal flooding. They represent sudden, catastrophic inundation, powerful enough to erase settlements and force populations to begin again. Not every city was affected equally. Some stood on higher ground. Others were founded later. But across the low-lying plains between the rivers, the evidence is consistent. Water came, and it changed everything. To the people living there, this was not a regional inconvenience. It was the end of the world as they knew it. Flood stories appear across the ancient Near East, preserved in multiple languages and traditions. Later cultures would inherit and adapt these accounts, weaving them into their own religious frameworks. But the earliest versions, preserved in Sumerian and Akkadian texts, are striking in their restraint. They describe warning, survival, and rebuilding. They do not celebrate destruction. They focus on continuity, on what was saved. This emphasis on preservation appears everywhere in Sumerian culture. Their mathematics uses a base 60 system so efficient that it still shapes how we measure time and space today. Their scribble schools trained students in advanced calculations, geometry, and accounting. Their medical texts describe treatments that modern science recognizes as biologically effective. Their astronomy tracks planetary cycles with patience and precision, requiring observation across generations. Their law codes distinguish between intent and accident, obligation and negligence, in ways that suggest long experience rather than sudden insight. None of this proves the existence of a lost high-technology civilization. Sophistication does not require machines or metals. Knowledge can accumulate quietly. Skills can be transmitted without leaving dramatic monuments behind. But the pattern remains difficult to ignore. In nearly every domain, Sumerian civilization appears already mature. Even their language deepens the mystery. Sumerian has no known relatives. It does not belong to any established language family. It does not resemble the Semitic languages that later dominated the region. Linguists call it an isolate, a surviving fragment of something larger that vanished without trace. Languages normally leave footprints, borrowed words, shared grammar, structural echoes. Sumerian stands alone. One explanation is that its relatives existed but were lost. Another is that it absorbed influences from earlier languages now extinct. Either way, the implication is the same. Sumerian did not emerge in isolation. It is the last visible remnant of a deeper linguistic landscape erased by time and catastrophe. The Sumerians themselves seemed aware of this fragility. They treated writing with reverence. They copied ancient texts faithfully, even when meanings became obscure. Long after Sumerian ceased to be spoken in daily life, scribes continued to learn it in schools. Kings commissioned inscriptions in it to legitimize their rule. Priests preserved it in ritual. It became a sacred language, not because it was new, but because it was old. What then were they trying to preserve? Their creation stories offer an unexpected clue. Unlike many later myths, Sumerian accounts of human origins are procedural. They describe trial and error, imperfect attempts, adjustments made over time. Humans are shaped from clay mixed with something else, something described as essence or understanding. The process fails repeatedly before stabilizing. This is not the language of instantaneous divine creation. It is the language of experimentation, translated into myth because no other vocabulary existed. Most scholars interpret these stories symbolically as reflections on human imperfection and social order. That reading is valid, but it may not be complete. Stories often preserve more than one layer of meaning. They can function simultaneously as metaphor and memory. If these texts were attempting to preserve knowledge about origins that had already passed beyond direct understanding, myth may have been the only vessel capable of carrying it forward. The figures who guide humanity through these stories are known as the Anunnaki. They are not distant, abstract gods. They teach. They organize. They establish cities, laws, and tools. They argue. They make mistakes. They are powerful, but not infinite. Across cultures separated by oceans and millennia, similar figures appear. Teachers from the sky, culture bearers who arrive after catastrophe, beings remembered as gods long after their original context faded. Whether these stories describe deified ancestors, symbolic forces, or something else entirely remains unresolved. What matters is that they reflect a worldview centered on inheritance. Knowledge is given. Order is restored. Memory survives disruption. And that brings us back to the clay. Clay tablets survive fire. They survive flood. When buildings burned, the heat hardened the tablets, preserving them more effectively. Catastrophe did not erase memory. It fixed it in place. Fingerprints remain pressed into surfaces shaped by hands that lived thousands of years ago. Those hands belonged to people who believed what they were writing mattered enough to outlast them. Maybe they were right. We often imagine ourselves standing at the peak of progress, looking forward into an unknown future. But sometimes, history suggests a different orientation. People looking backward, trying to save what they could from a deeper past. Writing not as invention, but as preservation. If that is true, then the oldest written words humanity left behind may not be telling us where we began. They may be telling us what survived. If the earliest writing was shaped by people who believed they were living after something had already been lost, then the question of origins shifts quietly but profoundly. Instead of asking how civilization began, we begin asking what kind of civilization might have existed before memory fractured. One of the most persistent assumptions in modern archaeology is linear progress. Stone tools lead to farming. Farming leads to villages. Villages grow into towns. Towns become cities. Writing emerges late in the process, once complexity demands record-keeping. This model works well in many regions. In the Nile Valley, layers of development stack neatly. In the Indus region, early farming settlements precede urban planning by centuries. In China, pottery traditions evolve slowly into writing systems that carry visible traces of each stage. Mesopotamia complicates this picture. Here, writing appears very early, and cities appear large. Administration arrives alongside urban life rather than trailing behind it. The gap between subsistence settlement and bureaucratic organization feels compressed. Archaeologists call this an acceleration. Others call it a problem. Either way, it forces a reconsideration of how knowledge moves through time. One explanation is inheritance. Inheritance does not require continuity of population or place. It only requires survival of information. Knowledge can outlive buildings. Techniques can outlast institutions. Ideas can pass through catastrophe if carried by people who understand their value. And catastrophe, particularly water, has a habit of selectively erasing the very environments where early complexity would have thrived. During the end of the last ice age, sea levels rose dramatically. Coastlines shifted inland. River valleys flooded and reshaped. Entire habitable zones disappeared beneath water that has not receded since. Archaeology on land captures only what remained above those rising waters. Anything built near ancient shores, estuaries, or floodplains would now lie submerged, buried, or dissolved. If complex societies existed in those places, their absence from the record would not be surprising. It would be expected. This does not prove that such societies existed, but it does weaken the argument that they could not have. The Sumerians seemed acutely aware of this fragility. Their myths do not celebrate dominance over nature. They emphasize balance, order, and repetition. Time moves in cycles. Civilizations rise, fall, and return. Kingship descends, vanishes, and descends again. The world is not born once. It is rebuilt. Even their measurement of time reflects this worldview. The base 60 system is not merely efficient. It is cyclical. Divisions repeat cleanly. Angles close on themselves. Days return to nights. Months track the moon. Years loop through seasons. This mathematics is not optimized for novelty. It is optimized for continuity. Their astronomical records reinforce this perspective. Sumerian and later Babylonian astronomers tracked the movements of planets not as abstract curiosities, but as repeating patterns woven into daily life. Venus, in particular, was observed carefully. Its appearances and disappearances were logged across long spans. These records required patience. They required institutions that could survive beyond a single lifetime. They required a belief that preserving pattern mattered. This kind of observational discipline does not emerge suddenly. It depends on tradition. The same is true of their legal frameworks. Early Sumerian laws do not read like the first attempts at justice. They assume familiarity with dispute. They anticipate conflict. They define responsibility in ways that suggest long experience. Property boundaries, inheritance, contracts, injury, and compensation are all addressed with nuance. Law here is not reactive. It is refined. Medical knowledge follows a similar pattern. Remedies are not framed as guesses. They are presented as established treatments. Plants are combined with intention. Preparation methods are specified. Outcomes are expected. Modern analysis has confirmed that many of these treatments would have been effective. This kind of pharmacological understanding requires observation across generations. Trial and error leaves casualties. What survives is what works. Yet the Sumerians did not claim to have discovered this knowledge themselves. Their educational texts speak of preservation. The scribble arts are described as ancient even to them. Students copy older exemplars. Teachers emphasize accuracy over innovation. Mistakes are corrected. Variations are discouraged. Fidelity matters more than originality. This reverence for the past is unusual in a culture supposedly standing at the dawn of civilization. It becomes more understandable if the past they revered was not abstract, but remembered. Memory does not always survive intact. It fragments. It transforms. It becomes story, symbol, and ritual. Over time, explanation gives way to metaphor. But fragments remain embedded in structure, in how systems are built, in what is emphasized, in what is preserved at great cost. The Sumerian creation narratives may be one such fragment. When humans are formed from clay mixed with an animating essence, the story does not claim magic alone. It describes combination. When early humans are flawed and adjusted, the narrative preserves the idea of process. When purpose is defined in terms of labor, organization, and maintenance of order, the story reflects a society deeply concerned with infrastructure rather than transcendence. These myths are often dismissed because they do not align with later religious expectations. They are not comforting. They are not flattering. Humans are not created as moral centers of the universe. They are created to work, to maintain, to stabilize. That utilitarian framing suggests memory rather than fantasy. The figures who oversee this process, the Anunnaki, occupy an unusual position. They are above humans, but not beyond limitation. They require food offerings. They inhabit temples. They delegate. They argue. They regret decisions. They are powerful administrators rather than omnipotent creators. In many cultures, beings remembered as gods began as something else. Leaders, teachers, survivors, ancestors whose knowledge became exaggerated as distance grew. Over generations, reverence replaces familiarity. Names remain. Context fades. The story lifts upward. This does not require extraterrestrial explanations or advanced machines. It only requires that knowledge once existed in a form later societies could not easily replicate. When that happens, the source of that knowledge acquires symbolic weight. Teachers become divine. Instruction becomes revelation. Across the world, similar patterns appear. Figures who arrive after catastrophe. Culture bearers who re-establish law, agriculture, astronomy, and building. Their names differ. Their imagery shifts. But their function remains constant. They bring order back to a broken world. Independent invention can explain some parallels. Shared human psychology can explain others. But when patterns align across continents, across eras, and across cultural boundaries, it is reasonable to pause and consider that memory, not imagination, may be doing part of the work. The Sumerians themselves never insisted we believe them. They simply recorded. They pressed wedges into clay and moved on. They copied older texts without explanation. They preserved lists whose numbers no longer made sense to them. They maintained rituals whose origins were forgotten. They behaved like caretakers, not originators. Perhaps that is the most revealing detail of all. Civilizations that believe they are first tend to advertise it. They celebrate innovation. They mythologize founders. They mark beginnings. The Sumerians marked restoration. Again and again, the language of their inscriptions points backward. Ancient plans, distant days, foundations laid long ago. If modern archaeology struggles with this, it may be because our own worldview is oriented forward. We expect progress to be additive. We expect complexity to grow. We expect the past to be simpler than the present. But history is not obligated to align with expectation. Catastrophe breaks lines. Floods erase libraries. Fire hardens tablets. Survival selects for durability, not completeness. What reaches us across millennia is not a fair sample. It is residue. Clay survives. Stone survives. Wood rots. Knowledge survives unevenly. Techniques that require delicate instruments vanish. Systems that depend on institutional continuity collapse. What remains are fragments strong enough to endure chaos. The Sumerians may represent such a fragment. Not the birth of civilization, but a re-emergence. A society rebuilding with inherited tools whose origins lay beyond its own horizon of memory. Writing, in this view, becomes an act of rescue, a way to anchor knowledge against further loss. If that is true, then the first words written in clay were not optimistic declarations of a new age. They were quiet acts of preservation, messages pressed into mud by people who understood how easily everything could disappear. And perhaps that is why those messages still reach us. Once we begin to look at Sumer through the lens of preservation rather than invention, details that once felt contradictory begin to settle into place. Take their education system. The scribble schools known as edubas were not informal spaces where writing was explored creatively. They were disciplined institutions. Students copied texts repeatedly until precision became instinct. Errors were corrected firmly. Deviations were discouraged. The goal was not expression, but transmission. Knowledge was something to be carried intact across time, not reshaped by individual insight. This makes sense if the material being taught was already considered ancient. You do not casually revise something you believe connects you to a deeper past. Even the physical format of their records reflects this attitude. Clay is heavy. It is awkward. It is not convenient for casual writing. Papyrus or parchment would have been easier, but they decay. Clay lasts. Clay survives flood, fire, and neglect. It is an odd choice, unless durability is the priority. In Mesopotamia, catastrophe was not hypothetical. Rivers flooded. Cities burned. Empires collapsed. Writing in clay was an insurance policy against forgetting. This awareness of fragility may also explain the Sumerian obsession with order. Their universe was governed by decrees. Everything had its place. Gods, kings, farmers, craftsmen, rivers, stars, and seasons all followed prescribed roles. Chaos was not creative. Chaos was destructive. The greatest threat was not ignorance, but disorder. This worldview fits a society shaped by recovery. When people rebuild after collapse, stability becomes sacred. Variation becomes dangerous. Memory becomes law. The flood narratives reinforce this theme. In the Sumerian versions, the flood is not framed as moral punishment in the later theological sense. It is a disaster, a rupture, a force of nature or divine decision that overwhelms everything familiar. The focus is not on sin, but on survival. Who warned whom? What was saved? How life resumed? The hero does not triumph. He endures. Afterward, the world continues, but changed. Lifespans shorten. Kingship becomes more limited. Humanity becomes less powerful, more constrained. This is not a story of ascent. It is a story of diminishment followed by adaptation. That tone matters. If these stories were pure myth, invented to explain the world from scratch, they could have been triumphant. They could have celebrated creation as a gift. Instead, they carry grief, loss, a sense that something greater existed before. This sense echoes faintly in the King List. The early reigns stretch across vast spans of time. The later reigns contract sharply. Something is lost between the two sections. The text does not explain what that something was. It simply marks the boundary and moves on. Modern readers often interpret the long reigns as symbolic exaggeration. That is reasonable. But symbolism does not erase the underlying pattern. Time itself behaves differently before and after the flood. That difference mattered enough to preserve. If the early section encoded cycles rather than biographies, then the list becomes a compressed archive of a much older temporal system. Later scribes may have copied it without understanding its original function, but they preserved it because it represented authority. It came from before the rupture. Preserving information without full comprehension is a common human behavior. We do it constantly. Rituals persist long after their original meaning fades. Language retains phrases whose origins are forgotten. Technologies are used without knowledge of why they work, only that they do. The Sumerians were no different. Their mathematical system offers a clear example. Base 60 is elegant, flexible, and efficient. It divides cleanly. It scales well. It supports geometry and astronomy naturally. Once adopted, it becomes deeply embedded. Changing it would disrupt everything built on top of it. So it persists. But where did it come from? There is no evidence of competing systems being tested and discarded. No base 10 experiments. No base 12 trials. 60 simply appears. Already integrated into measures of time, space, and quantity. Already normalized. That does not mean it was invented suddenly. It may have been inherited. If so, its origin lies beyond the earliest written record. The same pattern repeats in astronomy. Tracking planetary cycles requires not only observation, but comparison across long spans. Recognizing repetition demands memory. Recording patterns demands continuity. A single generation cannot do this alone. Knowledge must be passed down, corrected, refined, and trusted. The Venus records attributed to later Babylonian kings were copies of earlier observations. Those earlier observations likely depended on even older traditions. Someone began watching. Someone kept watching. Someone decided it mattered enough to record carefully. That chain of attention may stretch back further than we can see. Astronomy is often treated as a luxury of settled societies. In reality, it is a tool for survival. Seasons determine planting. Stars guide travel. Eclipses disrupt ritual calendars. Understanding the sky stabilizes life on the ground. A society rebuilding after catastrophe would have strong incentive to preserve this knowledge. Language itself may carry the deepest trace of this inheritance. Sumerian grammar is complex. It builds meaning by layering elements carefully. This structure is not simplistic. It allows precision. It allows nuance. It allows dense information to be compressed into compact forms. Such systems evolve over long periods of use. They are shaped by generations of speakers adapting language to practical needs. The fact that Sumerian appears fully formed, with no clear ancestors, suggests loss rather than sudden creation. Languages do not emerge in isolation. They grow out of other languages. When those relatives vanish, the survivor becomes an isolate. What event could erase an entire language family while leaving one branch barely intact? Population collapse. Displacement. Environmental disaster. Cultural replacement. All are possible. Flooding on a massive scale would accomplish exactly this. Low-lying regions disappear. Coastal communities vanish. Survivors regroup elsewhere, carrying fragments of speech with them. Over time, those fragments stabilize into a new standard, while their relatives remain underwater or unremembered. If that happened, then Sumerian writing captures not the birth of language, but its rescue. This perspective also reframes the role of myth. Myths are often treated as imaginative stories created to explain natural phenomena. That is one of their functions. But myths also serve as containers for memory. They encode events, processes, and relationships in forms that can survive when direct explanation fails. In cultures without scientific terminology, metaphor is not decoration. It is infrastructure. When Sumerian texts describe gods shaping humans from clay mixed with essence, the story preserves several key ideas. Humans are made deliberately. They are formed from earth. Something intangible gives them awareness. The process is iterative. Mistakes occur. Adjustments are made. These ideas align surprisingly well with modern understandings of development, selection, and adaptation, even though the language is entirely different. That does not mean the Sumerians understood biology as we do. It means they preserved a memory of process rather than miracle. Later cultures simplified creation. They favored instantaneous acts, perfection by command. The Sumerian accounts feel older, closer to observation, less polished. They sound like stories passed down from people who witnessed something they could not fully explain. Again, this does not require advanced technology in the modern sense. It requires time, attention, and continuity. The Anunnaki fit into this framework as figures of transmission. They are teachers, organizers, and judges. They establish order. They distribute rules. They maintain balance. Their authority derives not from omnipotence, but from knowledge. In many traditions, knowledge itself becomes sacred when its source is lost. Teachers become gods when memory stretches beyond recognition. Mainstream archaeology prefers explanations that minimize speculation. This caution is valuable. It protects against fantasy. But caution can also harden into resistance. Discoveries that challenge existing timelines often face dismissal before acceptance. Göbekli Tepe is a clear example. Monumental architecture built by hunter-gatherers was once unthinkable. Now, it is undeniable. That does not mean every unconventional idea is correct. It means that impossibility is often a temporary judgment. History shows that human capability has been underestimated repeatedly. Navigation without instruments, architecture without writing, astronomy without telescopes, medicine without chemistry. Each was once considered implausible. Each was later confirmed. It is reasonable, then, to allow room for possibilities beyond current consensus, especially when evidence is fragmentary. The Sumerians lived in a landscape shaped by water. Their cities rose along rivers that gave life and took it away. Their stories reflect this tension. Creation and destruction are never far apart. Memory exists because loss is expected. Perhaps that is why their writing feels so deliberate, so careful, so serious. They were not chronicling novelty. They were safeguarding continuity. If so, then asking whether the Sumerians recorded the true origin of humanity may be the wrong framing. A better question might be whether they recorded the last memory of something far older, a memory already fading when they pressed it into clay. If the Sumerians were working from fragments of a deeper past, then their worldview begins to make sense in a way that purely developmental models struggle to explain. They did not imagine time as a straight line. They imagined it as a series of renewals. The world was ordered, disrupted, and ordered again. Cities fell and were rebuilt. Knowledge disappeared and returned in altered form. This cyclical understanding appears everywhere in their thought, from kingship to cosmology to ritual calendars. Their gods did not create the universe once and withdraw. They intervened repeatedly. They repaired. They corrected. They restored balance when it failed. This is the theology of a people who had seen order collapse, not one inventing explanations for a stable world. Even the way Sumerian texts speak about authority reflects this. Kings are not innovators. They are caretakers. They restore temples according to ancient plans. They reaffirm boundaries set long ago. Their legitimacy rests on continuity, not originality. A good ruler is one who preserves what was handed down. That is a strange value system for a culture supposedly inventing civilization from nothing. It becomes less strange if innovation had already proven fragile. Across the archaeological record, we see moments where complexity appears and then vanishes. Farming techniques are abandoned. Settlements shrink. Tool traditions disappear. These are not always gradual declines. Sometimes they are abrupt. Climate shifts, floods, droughts, volcanic eruptions. Human history is punctuated by resets, many of which leave little trace beyond disruption itself. When a reset occurs, survivors rebuild with what they remember. Some skills survive. Others vanish. What returns is never identical to what was lost. It is an echo. The Sumerians may represent such an echo. This perspective helps explain why their civilization feels both advanced and constrained. They possessed sophisticated mathematics, astronomy, law, and administration. Yet their material technology remained relatively simple. They built with mud brick. They relied on human and animal labor. They worked bronze, not iron. This combination puzzles modern observers who expect technological systems to advance together. But knowledge does not move as a single package. Some forms of understanding are easier to preserve than others. Mathematical principles survive memory and teaching. Organizational structures survive ritual and habit. Precise manufacturing techniques require infrastructure, materials, and stable supply chains. When those vanish, knowledge alone cannot recreate them. A society rebuilding after catastrophe might retain abstract systems while losing practical capabilities that depend on specialized tools or environments. This could also explain why Sumerian texts emphasized teaching so heavily. Education was not optional. It was survival. Knowledge that failed to pass on would be lost again. The scribbled tradition became a safeguard against a second forgetting. Even their obsession with lists reflects this mentality. Lists of kings, lists of gods, lists of professions, lists of materials. Lists impose order on chaos. They stabilize memory. They create continuity where narrative might drift. The King List in this sense is not a historical chronicle in the modern sense. It is a statement of order, a declaration that authority persists across catastrophe. That kingship exists even when cities vanish. That time can be reassembled. When viewed this way, the long reigns before the flood take on new meaning. They may represent eras rather than individuals, phases of stability remembered as unified periods. When that stability ended, time fractured into smaller, more fragile segments. Human reigns replaced cosmic ones. This interpretation does not require belief in literal immortals. It requires recognition that ancient people measured significance differently. Longevity may have symbolized coherence rather than lifespan. A king who ruled for tens of thousands of years may represent an age that felt unbroken. After the flood, ages shorten. Memory compresses. History becomes granular. This shift mirrors what happens after trauma. The distant past becomes mythic. Recent events feel sharper, more detailed. The further back one looks, the broader the shapes become. Sumerian mythology preserves this psychological truth with remarkable consistency. The flood itself sits at the center of this memory. It is not merely a story. It is a boundary. Everything before it belongs to a different world. Everything after it belongs to the present. Archaeology confirms that flooding played a real and destructive role in Mesopotamian history. River systems there are unpredictable. Levees fail. Channels shift. Entire regions can be submerged quickly. Even today, floods reshape the landscape dramatically. In the ancient world, without modern control systems, the impact would have been devastating. When flood deposits appear across multiple sites, separating cultural layers cleanly, they demand attention. They tell us that disruption was not metaphorical. It was physical. But floods alone do not explain the depth of the Sumerian worldview. They explain loss, not inheritance. Inheritance implies transmission. How does knowledge survive collapse? Through people. Through oral tradition. Through ritualized practice. Through fragments carried across generations until conditions allow them to be recorded. Writing may have emerged in Sumer not because complexity suddenly required it, but because memory finally needed anchoring. Oral transmission reaches its limits. Stories drift. Details blur. Writing freezes a version in place. Once frozen, it can be copied. That may explain why the earliest written texts feel administrative rather than poetic. Before philosophy, before literature, before speculation, there was urgency. Count this. Record that. Preserve it accurately. Do not forget. Only later, once stability returned, did writing expand into myth, reflection, and introspection. This sequence reverses common assumptions. Writing is usually imagined as an intellectual leap. In Sumer, it may have been a defensive one. This idea resonates with the way clay tablets were treated physically. They were stored carefully, organized, archived. Some libraries contained tens of thousands of tablets. This was not casual record-keeping. It was institutional memory. And memory matters most when it has already been threatened. The persistence of Sumerian language long after it ceased to be spoken reinforces this interpretation. Languages usually die quietly. They are replaced by more useful tongues. But Sumerian was preserved deliberately. It became a language of scholarship and ritual. It was studied, not lived. That is what happens when a language is seen as a key, not merely a tool. It unlocks access to something valued. When that something is gone, the key becomes sacred. Later, Mesopotamian cultures treated Sumerian texts with reverence. They copied them faithfully. They translated them carefully. They preserved even obscure passages whose meanings were unclear. They believed these words carried authority simply by virtue of age. This reverence suggests continuity of belief, a shared understanding that Sumerian knowledge was foundational. not because it was the first, but because it preserved something older. The question of what that older something was remains open. Some propose that it was simply early agricultural knowledge accumulated through long experience. Others suggest it was organizational, social, or symbolic rather than technological. Some entertain the idea of lost civilizations with capabilities we no longer recognize. Others caution that we may be projecting modern expectations onto ancient evidence. All of these positions share a common admission. The record is incomplete. Mainstream archaeology is careful by necessity. It builds models from surviving evidence. When evidence is missing, it prefers conservative explanations. This is sensible, but it can also blind inquiry to possibilities that fall outside established frameworks. Discoveries like Göbekli Tepe remind us that our frameworks are provisional. Monumental construction without agriculture once seemed impossible. Now it is undeniable. The timeline expanded. The narrative shifted. Similar expansions may yet occur. The absence of evidence for advanced ancient knowledge does not prove it never existed. It proves only that it did not survive in forms we currently recognize. Knowledge tied to organic materials, perishable instruments, or fragile environments would leave little trace. If such knowledge existed, it would most likely survive indirectly. In systems, in numbers, in stories, in practices that no longer reveal their origins clearly. Sumerian culture is filled with such practices. Their division of time, their mapping of the sky, their ritual calendars, their legal principles, their emphasis on restoration. All of these may be remnants rather than innovations. This does not require abandoning scientific rigor. It requires humility, a recognition that history is filtered through survival. What we see is not what existed, but what endured. The Sumerians seem to understand this instinctively. They wrote as if time was fragile, as if memory needed reinforcement, as if the past mattered not because it was gone, but because it could vanish again. If that is true, then the clay tablets do not announce humanity's beginning. They mark a pause, a moment when people decided that forgetting was too dangerous to allow. And so they wrote. As the picture widens, the Sumerian world begins to feel less like a starting point and more like a crossroads. They stand at a place where memory, loss, and reconstruction intersect. Behind them, a past that feels deeper than their own experience. Ahead of them, a future they could not see, but clearly feared might repeat the same cycles of collapse. This anxiety about recurrence may explain why Sumerian texts return again and again to the idea of divine decrees. These decrees are not creative acts. They are rules that sustain order. When decrees are followed, the world functions. When they are ignored or broken, chaos follows. Floods come. Cities fall. Balance is lost. This framing does not celebrate novelty. It warns against deviation. In such a worldview, innovation is dangerous unless it aligns with inherited patterns. Change must be justified by precedent. Stability is achieved through alignment with what came before. This attitude may also explain why Sumerian culture did not aggressively pursue technological transformation in the way modern societies do. Their goal was not progress for its own sake. It was continuity. They built systems that worked and then preserved them. Their irrigation canals followed gradients that sustained agriculture. Their city plans optimized movement and drainage. Their administrative systems tracked resources efficiently. Once established, these systems were maintained rather than reinvented. This is not stagnation. It is resilience. Resilience is what allows knowledge to persist through disruption. The idea that advanced knowledge might exist without leaving obvious technological remains often feels counterintuitive to modern minds. We associate advancement with machines, metals, and energy consumption. But knowledge does not always express itself materially. It can manifest socially, mathematically, or cosmologically. A society deeply attuned to cycles, patterns, and organization might appear simple materially while being complex conceptually. It might leave behind few artifacts that look impressive by modern standards, yet possess understanding that shaped survival for thousands of years. If such a society existed before the Sumerians, its destruction would leave behind uneven traces. Heavy stone structures might survive. Organic tools would not. Written records, if they existed on perishable materials, would vanish entirely. Only indirect echoes would remain. Those echoes might appear as inexplicable sophistication in later cultures. This possibility does not demand belief in forgotten machines or lost global empires. It requires only that human capability has fluctuated more dramatically than our linear narratives allow. History shows repeated peaks and collapses. The Bronze Age collapse erased entire civilizations. Knowledge was lost. Writing systems disappeared. Trade networks collapsed. Recovery took centuries. If such devastation could occur in a literate, interconnected world, it could certainly occur earlier, leaving even fewer traces. The Sumerians lived not long after one such collapse. Their texts remember a flood that divided time. Whether this flood corresponds to a single geological event or to a composite memory of repeated disasters matters less than its psychological impact. It marked an ending, and endings shape stories. When cultures reflect on origins after loss, they often frame beginnings in terms of restoration. The world must be rebalanced. Order must be re-established. Knowledge must be recovered. This framing may be more than symbolic. It may preserve practical truth. Consider how oral traditions work. Information is encoded in narrative to survive repetition. Accuracy depends on structure, not detail. Key elements are retained. Peripheral explanations drift. Over time, metaphor replaces mechanism. By the time writing emerges, the original context may already be gone. What remains is story, ritual, and system. The Sumerians wrote at precisely this threshold, late enough that memory had begun to blur, early enough that enough still survived to be recorded. Their tablets capture a world already ancient to them. This may explain why their myths are unusually procedural. They describe sequences, steps, decisions, consequences. These are hallmarks of transmitted knowledge, not imaginative invention, but remembered process. The creation narratives, when read without later theological assumptions, do not read like poetry. They read like instruction manuals rendered in symbolic language. They describe materials, roles, failures, corrections. This is not how one invents a myth. It is how one preserves a memory that no longer fits everyday experience. The Anunnaki, in this context, become something like placeholders. They stand in for actors whose nature was no longer understood. Over time, reverence transformed them into gods. Their actions became divine. Their authority became cosmic, but their functions remained practical. They teach irrigation. They establish cities. They distribute labor. They judge disputes. They bring agriculture, astronomy, and law. These are not abstract gifts. They are survival skills. The same pattern appears in many cultures. Teachers become gods when their knowledge outlasts their names. Ancestors become divine when their achievements can no longer be replicated. The line between memory and worship blurs. Modern archaeology tends to separate myth from history cleanly. Myth is symbolic. History is factual. But in early societies, this division did not exist. Myth was history rendered survivable. History was myth, anchored in practice. Understanding this allows us to read ancient texts with greater sensitivity. Instead of asking whether they are literally true or completely false, we can ask what kind of truth they preserve. The Sumerians may not have been recording the origin of humanity in the biological sense. They may have been recording the origin of their world, a world already shaped by forces beyond their control, a world inherited, not created. That distinction matters. If they were inheritors, then their sudden sophistication is not mysterious. It is expected. They were not building from zero. They were rebuilding from fragments. This reframing also softens the tension between mainstream archaeology and alternative perspectives. Archaeology deals in material evidence. Alternative perspectives often focus on patterns, myths, and anomalies. Both are responding to incomplete information. The challenge arises when one claims exclusivity, when material absence is treated as disproof, or when myth is treated as literal documentation without qualification. A more productive approach recognizes limits on both sides. Material evidence is partial. Myth is encoded. Neither tells the full story alone. When they align, something meaningful may be preserved. The flood layers align with flood stories. The abrupt cultural shifts align with narratives of disruption. The persistence of mathematical systems aligns with claims of inheritance. The isolation of language aligns with population loss. None of these prove a single dramatic conclusion. Together, they suggest complexity. They suggest that the past was not simple, that humanity's story may be longer, more fragile, and more cyclical than our models prefer. The Sumerians themselves seem to accept this complexity. They did not attempt to resolve it. They recorded what they knew. They preserved what they could. They allowed contradiction to remain. They wrote as if uncertainty was part of reality. Perhaps that is their most important lesson. In a world where certainty is often demanded, the Sumerians remind us that survival does not require complete understanding. It requires memory, humility, and the willingness to carry fragments forward without knowing exactly where they came from. The clay tablets endure because they were never meant to explain everything. They were meant to keep something alive. What that something was remains open, and perhaps it should. As the distance between the present and the Sumerian world stretches, one detail becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. The people who left these tablets behind did not behave like founders standing at the dawn of something new. They behaved like witnesses standing after an ending. This distinction matters because it changes how we interpret everything they recorded. Founders tend to celebrate innovation. They name discoverers after themselves. They tell stories about first moments, heroic breakthroughs, and sudden insight. Witnesses of collapse tend to emphasize continuity. They repeat what they were told. They preserve forms even when the reasons behind them fade. They worry about accuracy rather than originality. The Sumerians fall firmly into the second category. Their reverence for ancient plans, distant days, and forgotten builders is not performative. It is consistent. In inscription after inscription, kings describe their work as restoration. Temples are rebuilt according to designs laid down long before the current ruler lived. Rituals are renewed, not invented. Laws are reaffirmed rather than created. Even their greatest literary work, the Epic of Gilgamesh, is framed as recovery rather than discovery. The story opens with an invitation to look upon ancient walls and inscriptions. Gilgamesh himself seeks knowledge that already exists. He travels to learn what survived the flood. Wisdom lies behind him, not ahead. This backward gaze is unusual for an early civilization. It suggests a cultural memory oriented around loss. That loss may not have been singular. Flooding in Mesopotamia occurred repeatedly. River systems shifted unpredictably. Entire settlements could be erased in a single season. Over centuries, these events accumulate. Stories compress. Multiple disasters merge into one remembered catastrophe. The flood becomes symbolic not because it is imaginary, but because it represents a pattern. When time collapses like this, memory adapts. The Sumerian flood narrative may preserve the memory of several events layered together, or it may preserve one especially devastating event whose impact overshadowed all others. Either way, it functioned as a dividing line, before and after, and it shaped how the Sumerians understood themselves. They saw humanity as diminished compared to earlier ages. Lifespans shortened. Power waned. The world became more constrained. This is not the story of progress. It is the story of decline followed by stabilization. In many cultures, myths of a golden age appear. A time when humans lived longer, knew more, and were closer to the divine. Scholars often dismiss these as nostalgic fantasy. But nostalgia usually idealizes recent pasts. The Sumerian Golden Age lies impossibly far back, beyond memory, beyond verification. That distance makes it less like romantic longing and more like inherited tradition. If the Sumerians believed that knowledge once flowed more freely, that humans once lived in closer alignment with the cosmos, this belief would shape their priorities. Preservation would become sacred. Innovation would be suspect. Stability would be the highest virtue. This worldview aligns with their legal and moral systems. Justice is about restoring balance, not advancing ideals. Punishments aim to compensate and correct, not transform society. Order is maintained, not reinvented. It also aligns with their cosmology. The universe is governed by laws that pre-exist humanity. Humans must align with them or suffer consequences. The gods themselves are bound by decrees. No one stands outside order. This is not the worldview of a culture inventing explanations from scratch. It is the worldview of a culture inheriting a framework too old to question comfortably. That inherited framework may also explain why certain ideas appear in Sumerian thought that feel strikingly modern. Their understanding of time as cyclical rather than linear. Their use of mathematics to model natural phenomena. Their emphasis on systems over individuals. Their belief that human behavior is shaped by environment, law, and tradition rather than isolated choice. These ideas emerge naturally in societies that have observed long patterns. They do not require advanced technology. They require patience and memory. Patience leaves few archaeological traces. A society that watches the sky for centuries may leave behind tables of numbers, but little else. A society that understands seasonal cycles deeply may optimize agriculture without leaving monumental remains. A society that organizes itself efficiently may appear materially modest while being conceptually advanced. If such a society existed before the Sumerians, its destruction would leave behind exactly the kind of record we see: fragmentary, indirect, preserved only where durable materials allowed. Stone monuments survive. Clay tablets survive. Everything else dissolves. This is why the absence of evidence for deep antiquity cannot be treated as definitive. Archaeology is constrained by preservation. What it uncovers is shaped by geology, climate, and chance. Entire chapters of human history may lie beneath oceans or under sediments too deep to excavate. Modern science acknowledges this in principle, but struggles with it in practice. Models require boundaries. Timelines require anchors. When evidence pushes those boundaries outward, resistance is natural. Göbekli Tepe challenged assumptions about social organization and ritual. It forced a revision of what hunter-gatherers were capable of. That revision did not occur because archaeologists wanted it to. It occurred because stone stood where theory said it should not. Other revisions may follow. The Sumerians themselves did not frame their knowledge as revolutionary. They framed it as inherited. That humility may be the most trustworthy aspect of their record. They did not claim to understand everything. They did not claim to be first. They claimed to remember. This remembering extended beyond practical knowledge into existential questions. Their myths grapple with mortality, loss, and the limits of human power. Gilgamesh fails to escape death. Utnapishtim survives the flood, but cannot share immortality. Humanity persists, but within boundaries. These stories are not triumphant. They are sobering. A culture inventing itself might celebrate endless potential. A culture rebuilding might emphasize limits. The Anunnaki, again, fit neatly into this frame. They are not presented as perfect beings. They are flawed. They regret decisions. They argue. They require assistance. Their authority is not absolute. It is functional. This portrayal suggests memory rather than abstraction. Abstract gods tend to be timeless and omnipotent. Remembered figures tend to be complex and constrained. Over time, memory simplifies. Figures merge. Attributes blur. Divinity expands to fill gaps in understanding. But traces of humanity remain in the stories. When similar figures appear across distant cultures, the simplest explanation is not necessarily borrowing or coincidence. It may be shared ancestry of experience. Human groups separated by catastrophe carry similar memories forward, encoding them differently but retaining core functions. This does not imply a single global civilization. It implies shared vulnerability. Floods, climate shifts, and environmental changes affected humans everywhere at the end of the last ice age. Sea levels rose. Landscapes transformed. Populations migrated. Knowledge fractured. In such a world, stories of teachers, survivors, and restorers would arise naturally. Those who knew how to navigate the new reality would be remembered. Those memories would acquire symbolic weight as generations passed. By the time writing emerged in Sumer, those memories may have already been ancient. Writing fixed them in place. That act alone is remarkable. Once written, memory becomes less flexible. It resists reinterpretation. It can be copied accurately across centuries. It can survive languages shifting and empires falling. The Sumerians may not have known exactly what they were preserving, but they knew it mattered. That knowledge, whatever its origin, shaped everything that followed. The civilizations of Mesopotamia influenced the ancient world profoundly. Their systems spread. Their mathematics traveled. Their myths were adapted. Their legal ideas echoed in later codes. Their cosmology informed later religions. If their foundation rested on inheritance rather than invention, then much of what we call civilization may itself be inherited. Not from gods, not from aliens, from people, from earlier humans whose world ended and whose memory survived unevenly. This perspective does not diminish humanity. It deepens it. It suggests that we are not merely builders, but carriers, that our greatest achievement may not be creation, but preservation. The Sumerians understood this. They wrote it into clay. As we approach the midpoint of this exploration, the question remains open, deliberately so. Did the Sumerians record the true origin of humanity? Or did they record the last memory of a world that came before their own? Either possibility challenges comfortable timelines. Both invite humility. And perhaps humility is the correct posture when listening to voices that have waited 5,000 years to be heard. If humility is the correct posture when listening to the Sumerians, then certainty is the one thing their records quietly discourage. They do not tell us exactly what existed before them. They do not offer diagrams of lost cities or instructions for forgotten machines. They offer something subtler and perhaps more honest. They offer traces of worldview, priorities, assumptions, fears. What they chose to preserve tells us as much as what they did not. They preserved systems, not stories of heroes. They preserved measurements, calendars, legal structures, ritual sequences, administrative order. These are not the things a culture invents for entertainment. These are the things a culture preserves when it believes survival depends on them. If earlier societies existed and were lost, their most valuable inheritance would not have been monuments. It would have been methods, ways of organizing people, ways of reading the sky, ways of aligning human activity with natural cycles. Those are precisely the things that appear most fully formed in Sumer. Consider again their understanding of time. Days divided into equal parts, months tracked carefully, years regulated through observation rather than abstraction, intercalation applied to keep calendars aligned with seasons. This is not intuitive. It requires sustained attention and correction. Without it, agriculture fails, and ritual loses coherence. Timekeeping is foundational. A society that loses it loses coordination. The Sumerians treated time as something fragile that needed management. That attitude suggests inherited experience with what happens when it fails. Their architecture reflects similar concern. Temples were not only religious centers, they were administrative hubs, storage facilities, distribution points, economic regulators. Built on elevated platforms, they survived floods better than surrounding structures. They were places of refuge and continuity. This practical role of temples aligns with their mythological importance. Gods lived there not because the buildings were symbolic, but because they were essential. The divine and the administrative were inseparable. If earlier societies had learned the importance of central coordination during crisis, that lesson would be worth preserving. The ziggurats that later dominate Mesopotamian cities are often described as religious monuments. They are also statements of stability, layered, reinforced, visible from a distance. They anchor the city physically and symbolically. They connect earth and sky, but they also survive when everything else collapses. Their alignment with celestial events further reinforces the link between architecture and astronomy. These buildings were instruments as much as shrines. They encoded orientation, seasonality, and rhythm into stone and brick. Again, this does not require lost technology. It requires attention and continuity. The question then becomes not whether advanced knowledge existed before Sumer, but what kind of knowledge survives catastrophe. Complex manufacturing processes are fragile. They depend on supply chains, specialized tools, and stable environments. Abstract knowledge is more resilient. It can be carried by people, taught orally, embedded in ritual, passed through apprenticeship. When collapse occurs, abstract systems are more likely to survive than material ones. This explains why mathematics and astronomy often appear earlier than expected in the archaeological record. They leave minimal material traces beyond notation. When notation finally appears, the systems behind it may already be old. Writing freezes a moment in that process. The Sumerian tablets may capture the point where accumulated abstract knowledge finally found a durable medium. This perspective also clarifies why the earliest writing is so administrative. Before art and philosophy, there was coordination. Who receives grain? Who owes labor? Who owns land? Who maintains canals? These questions matter immediately after collapse. Administration is not glamorous, but it is essential. If earlier societies collapsed due to failures in coordination, their descendants would prioritize record-keeping above all else. The Sumerians may have inherited that lesson the hard way. Their laws reflect a deep concern with predictability, clear consequences, defined responsibilities, compensation rather than vengeance, stability over spectacle. Law exists to prevent escalation, to keep disputes from tearing communities apart. This legal mindset fits a society determined to avoid repeating past disasters. Even their cosmology reinforces this goal. The gods enforce order. When order breaks, disaster follows. Humanity's role is to maintain balance, not to challenge it. Hubris invites catastrophe. This worldview does not celebrate expansion. It warns against excess. In later cultures, especially those that experienced long periods of stability, myth often becomes more triumphalist. Gods create effortlessly. Humans conquer nature. Progress is inevitable. The Sumerian tone is different. It is cautious. That caution may be inherited wisdom. Mainstream archaeology, by necessity, focuses on what can be demonstrated. It builds from evidence outward. But evidence is shaped by survival bias. What survives is not representative of what existed. It is representative of what endured specific conditions. When entire environments vanish, the societies tied to them vanish as well. their absence is not evidence of non-existence. It is evidence of vulnerability. Sea level rise at the end of the last ice age reshaped the planet. Coastlines moved inward dramatically. Large portions of the continental shelves were exposed land before flooding. These regions would have been attractive for settlement. Freshwater access, marine resources, fertile soils. If complex human activity occurred in these zones, it now lies underwater. Underwater archaeology is difficult, expensive, and limited. Only a fraction of submerged landscapes has been explored. Even when sites are found, organic materials rarely survive. What we find are stone tools, not systems. This gap in the record invites caution when making claims about impossibility. It is easy to say something never existed when its traces are inaccessible. The Sumerians lived inland, but their memories may have originated elsewhere. Survivors of coastal or riverine societies could have migrated inward as waters rose. They would bring knowledge, stories, and practices with them. Over generations, those would integrate with local traditions, producing something new that still carried old DNA. Sumerian culture may be such a hybrid, a fusion of inherited systems and local adaptation. This could explain why their language appears isolated. It may be the stabilized remnant of a displaced population, its relatives drowned or dispersed beyond recognition. It could explain why their myths emphasize mixture, clay and essence, old and new, divine and human. These metaphors mirror cultural blending. It could explain why their identity centers on restoration. They were not starting fresh. They were reassembling. This interpretation does not require rejecting mainstream archaeology. It requires expanding it, allowing for deeper timelines, accepting that some evidence is gone forever, working with probabilities rather than certainties. History is not a complete puzzle with all pieces available. It is a damaged artifact. We infer its original shape from fragments. The Sumerians understood this intuitively. Their texts do not attempt to resolve every contradiction. They accept ambiguity. They preserve competing traditions. They allow uncertainty to coexist with order. This may be why their civilization proved so influential. It was not brittle. It did not depend on a single narrative. It could absorb change while maintaining structure. That flexibility allowed their systems to be adopted, adapted, and preserved by later cultures. Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, all inherited Sumerian frameworks. They translated texts, copied rituals, preserved calendars. They understood that Sumerian knowledge mattered, even if its origins were obscure. In this sense, Sumerian civilization functions like a hinge in history. Before it, memory is mostly oral. After it, memory becomes written. Once written, it becomes harder to lose entirely. The act of writing itself may be the most important inheritance from whatever came before. Writing allowed humanity to store memory outside the body, to survive beyond individual lifespans, to endure catastrophe more effectively. If earlier societies lacked durable writing, their collapse would erase them almost completely. Sumer appears at the moment when writing becomes stable enough to resist erasure. This timing may not be accidental. It may represent the final lesson learned from repeated loss. That memory must be externalized to survive. If so, then the Sumerians were not recording the origin of humanity. They were recording humanity's realization that memory itself must be protected. That realization changed everything. Civilization becomes less about innovation and more about continuity, less about conquest and more about preservation, less about the future and more about safeguarding the past. The Sumerians lived at that turning point. They left behind clay tablets not because they loved writing, but because they feared forgetting. And perhaps that fear was justified. Fear of forgetting has shaped human behavior far more deeply than fear of death itself. Death is personal. Forgetting is collective. When a society forgets, it does not merely lose individuals. It loses orientation, purpose, context. The Sumerians seem to have understood this with unusual clarity. Their texts rarely dwell on personal legacy. Kings boast less about conquest and more about maintenance. Walls repaired, canals cleared, temples rebuilt, stability preserved. Even when they describe warfare, it is framed as restoration of balance rather than expansion of power. This perspective suggests that collapse was not theoretical to them. It was remembered. If earlier worlds had fallen apart, if knowledge had been scattered or nearly erased, then survival would depend on repetition, on doing things the same way again and again until they became habit. Habit survives stress better than innovation. This may explain why Sumerian culture feels conservative despite its sophistication. Innovation existed, but it moved carefully. New kings did not rewrite systems. They inserted themselves into existing ones. Even divine authority was inherited. Gods passed power to descendants. Nothing began from nothing. The Sumerian cosmos is genealogical. Everything descends from something else. Order flows downward. This is not the cosmology of spontaneous creation. It is the cosmology of continuity. The Anunnaki themselves fit this structure. They are offspring of earlier forces. They govern domains rather than creating them. They administer rather than invent. Their power comes from position within an existing hierarchy, not from absolute control. If these figures originated as memories of people or groups who once held critical knowledge, their later elevation into divine administrators makes sense. Knowledge becomes authority. Authority becomes sacred. Sacred becomes untouchable. As time passes, explanations fade, but structure remains. This pattern is visible in many human traditions. Technical processes become rituals. Practical rules become moral laws. Survival strategies become taboos. Once the environment that generated them changes, the rules persist long after their original function is forgotten. The Sumerians appear to be operating within such a legacy. Their reverence for cosmic order suggests that they believed deviation had consequences beyond human intention. This belief may have been reinforced by experience. If earlier societies collapsed due to misalignment with environmental realities, then order would be more than abstract virtue. It would be survival strategy. Their flood narratives reinforce this lesson. Floods come not because of individual wrongdoing, but because balance is broken. Noise becomes too great. Boundaries are crossed. The system fails. This framing shifts responsibility away from morality and toward structure. It is not about sin. It is about overload. Modern societies are familiar with this concept, even if they frame it differently. Systems collapse when stress exceeds capacity. Infrastructure fails. Supply chains break. Coordination falters. Collapse is not punishment. It is consequence. The Sumerians encoded this understanding into myth because myth was the most durable medium available. This may be why their myths feel strangely modern in places. They describe feedback loops, thresholds, limits, consequences. They do not promise endless growth. They warn against it. If we read these texts without imposing later religious frameworks, they appear less like superstition and more like systems thinking rendered in narrative form. The gods debate policy. They disagree. They regret decisions. They revise plans. These are not attributes of cosmic abstractions. They are attributes of governing bodies. One could read these stories as dramatized records of councils, decision-making processes, and leadership structures remembered across generations. As those memories stretched beyond recognition, they became mythologized, but their functional core remained intact. Again, this does not require belief in extraordinary beings. It requires recognition that human memory transforms leadership into legend over time. If a group of people once possessed critical knowledge that allowed communities to survive environmental instability, they would be remembered as saviors, as teachers, as bringers of order, as guardians of wisdom. Over centuries, those memories would crystallize into divine figures. This process is not speculative. It is documented repeatedly in human history. Ancestor worship, hero cults, deified rulers, sacred founders. The boundary between history and myth is porous. What makes the Sumerian case distinctive is how early this process appears in written form. The tablets preserve myth at a stage where it still retains procedural detail. It has not yet been smoothed into pure symbolism. This makes Sumerian mythology unusually valuable. It sits close to the threshold between memory and invention. That threshold is where lost knowledge leaves its fingerprints. One of the most intriguing aspects of Sumerian thought is how little interest it shows in personal transcendence. There is no promise of heaven for ordinary people. The afterlife is bleak and shadowy. Meaning is found in maintaining order during life, not escaping it after death. This emphasis aligns with a society focused on continuity rather than individual destiny. Survival matters. Legacy matters. Personal fulfillment does not. If the memory of collapse loomed large, this focus would be rational. The Epic of Gilgamesh reinforces this. Gilgamesh seeks immortality and fails. What remains is the city, the walls, the works maintained for future generations. Meaning resides in preservation, not escape. This message would resonate deeply in a culture rebuilding after disaster. Even their treatment of kingship reflects this pragmatism. Kings are not divine by nature. They are chosen, appointed, sometimes removed. Their authority is conditional. They are accountable to gods, councils, and tradition. This political structure suggests inherited lessons about concentration of power. Absolute authority is dangerous. Balance must be maintained. If earlier societies collapsed under centralized control, this lesson would be remembered. Thus, Sumerian civilization appears shaped by caution at every level. Environmental, social, political, cosmic. Caution does not emerge spontaneously. It emerges from experience. The question then becomes whether that experience belonged entirely to the Sumerians, or whether it belonged to people who came before them. If the latter, then Sumerian culture is a bridge, It carries memory across a rupture. It translates experience into systems that can survive. Writing is the final piece of that bridge. Once writing exists, memory can outlast catastrophe more reliably. Oral traditions fade. Writing endures. Clay hardens. Knowledge stabilizes. The Sumerians may have been the first to understand this fully. That realization alone would justify their urgency. They wrote not to express themselves, but to anchor the world. Seen in this light, the earliest writing is not a celebration. It is a safeguard, and the fact that it survived suggests that it worked. We read these tablets thousands of years later because someone feared that without them, everything would vanish again. That fear was not misplaced. If writing was a safeguard, then the Sumerians were not merely scribes. They were guardians of continuity. This role shaped not only what they wrote, but how they thought. The act of recording became inseparable from the act of maintaining order. To write something down was to protect it from erasure. To copy it accurately was an ethical act. Later Mesopotamian scribes understood this deeply. When they copied Sumerian texts centuries after the language had ceased to be spoken, they did so with extraordinary care. Errors were corrected. Variants were noted. Some tablets even preserve earlier versions alongside later ones, as if the scribes were reluctant to overwrite the past entirely. This behavior reflects reverence, but also anxiety. When knowledge is perceived as fragile, fidelity becomes paramount. That anxiety may trace back to an earlier rupture, a time when knowledge was lost not because it was wrong, but because it was not preserved well enough. If so, then the emergence of formal education in Sumer takes on new significance. Scribble schools were not casual institutions. They were demanding. Students memorized long lists. They practiced signs endlessly. They copied texts repeatedly until precision became automatic. This is not how one trains creative thinkers. It is how one trains custodians. The goal was not originality. It was accuracy. Education in Sumer functioned as a transmission system. Knowledge passed from teacher to student through disciplined repetition. Deviations were discouraged. The past was authoritative. This structure mirrors oral traditions that survived disaster. Psalms, chants, and rituals are preserved through exact repetition. Variation weakens memory. Fidelity strengthens it. Writing did not replace this mindset. It formalized it. Once again, this suggests inheritance rather than invention. If earlier societies had learned the cost of forgetting, they would emphasize preservation over experimentation. They would create systems that favored continuity even at the expense of flexibility. The Sumerians may represent the culmination of that lesson. Their worldview also reveals an awareness of scale. They did not imagine humanity as central to the universe. Humans exist within a larger order governed by forces beyond control. The heavens move regardless of human desire. The rivers flood regardless of human plans. This cosmic humility contrasts with later traditions that place humanity at the center of creation. It suggests observation rather than projection. A society that has witnessed environmental upheaval would naturally decenter human importance. Nature becomes dominant. Order becomes fragile. The Sumerians encoded this humility into their myths. The gods are powerful but not benevolent in a personal sense. They manage systems. They are concerned with balance, not comfort. Humans are necessary. but replaceable. They serve functions. They maintain infrastructure. They uphold rituals that stabilize the world. This is not a flattering self-image. It is a realistic one. If earlier societies collapsed due to overconfidence or misalignment, this humility would be a corrective. Their astronomy reinforces this stance. Celestial bodies are not decorative. They are signals, indicators of seasonal change, agricultural timing, and ritual cycles. The sky is red, not worshipped blindly. Astronomical observation requires patience. Nights of watching. Years of comparison. Generations of data. The Sumerians did not frame this knowledge as discovery. They framed it as reception. The heavens revealed patterns. Humans learned to recognize them. This passive language is telling. It suggests that the patterns existed long before the observers. Knowledge is uncovered, not created. If such observational traditions existed before writing, they would be transmitted orally until recording became possible. Once recorded, they would appear suddenly, fully formed. This may be exactly what we see. Mathematics in Sumer appears not as experimentation, but as curriculum. Tables are standardized. Procedures are taught. Solutions are expected. This is not the language of discovery. It is the language of instruction. Someone already knew how these systems worked. The medical texts show similar characteristics. Remedies are listed without justification. There is no explanation of why they work, only that they do. This is how inherited knowledge is preserved. The explanation is lost. The practice remains. Over time, myth may fill the explanatory gap. Divine origin replaces forgotten rationale. This process does not imply deception. It implies survival. When knowledge works, it is kept. When its origin is unclear, it is sacralized. The Sumerians appear to be operating within this dynamic across every domain. Their metallurgy, agriculture, and engineering show competence without narrative. They do not tell stories of invention. They simply do. This silence may be more revealing than any boast. If earlier societies existed and were lost, the survivors would not know the full story. They would know only what worked and what failed. Their descendants would inherit the results without the reasons. Sumerian culture reflects this condition. Their myths preserve outlines. Their systems preserve function. Their language preserves structure. Their writing preserves memory. But the original context remains out of reach. This is not a flaw in the record. It is the nature of transmission across catastrophe. Modern discomfort with this ambiguity often leads to polarized interpretations. Either the past was primitive and linear, or it was advanced and deliberately erased. Both positions seek certainty when none exists. The Sumerians themselves offer a more measured stance. They preserve uncertainty. They acknowledge loss. They accept limits. Perhaps this is the stance we should adopt as well. Rather than asking whether the Sumerians recorded the true origin of humanity in a literal sense, we might ask a quieter question. What kind of origin did they believe mattered? Their answer appears consistent. The origin that mattered was not biological, but civilizational. Not the moment humans appeared, but the moment order was restored. If humanity had fallen before, then restoration was the true beginning. This reframing dissolves some of the tension between evidence and speculation. It allows for deep antiquity without requiring precise reconstruction. It honors memory without demanding certainty. The Sumerians wrote what they could. They preserved what they believed essential. They left gaps where memory failed. Those gaps invite inquiry, but also restraint. As we continue, the final chapters will draw these threads together. The writing, the memory, the loss, the restoration, and the question that remains unresolved, perhaps intentionally: what was remembered? And what was already forgotten when the first tablet was pressed into clay? By the time the first tablets were pressed into clay, forgetting had already done its work. This is easy to miss when we look backward through thousands of years. Writing feels ancient to us, but to the Sumerians, writing was new. What it captured was not the beginning of memory, but the remainder of it. Everything that came before writing had already passed through countless human minds. It had been shaped by storytelling, ritual, correction, and loss. What reached the clay was already distilled. That alone should make us cautious about expecting completeness. When modern readers encounter gaps in the Sumerian record, the instinct is to treat them as failures. Missing explanations, unanswered questions, inconsistencies. But these gaps may not represent ignorance. They may represent damage. Memory does not degrade evenly. Some things survive clearly, others blur. Some vanish entirely. What survives is usually what mattered most. The Sumerians remembered order. They remembered systems. They remembered relationships between humans, land, sky, and time. They remembered that balance mattered, and that imbalance brought catastrophe. They did not remember precise origins. This is exactly what one would expect after a profound disruption. Imagine a society displaced by flood, famine, or climate collapse. Survivors scatter. Populations mix. Languages shift. Children grow up hearing fragments of stories they cannot fully contextualize. By the time stability returns, the old world is already distant. When writing finally emerges, it captures not the event, but the interpretation of the event as it survived. The Sumerians were not trying to deceive. They were trying to preserve. That preservation took the form of repetition. Repeated phrases. Repeated formulas. Repeated claims of restoration. These are stabilizing mechanisms. They anchor memory where detail fails. This is why the phrase "from distant days" appears so often. It signals authority without explanation. It allows knowledge to persist even when its origin is unclear. Modern science prefers explanation. Ancient cultures often prioritized continuity. These priorities need not conflict. The problem arises when continuity is mistaken for invention, or when explanation is demanded where none survived. The Sumerians themselves did not insist that their accounts be taken literally. They did not draw sharp boundaries between myth, history, and instruction. Those distinctions are modern. To them, a story could be true without being precise. A number could be meaningful without being literal. A god could represent a raw rather than an entity. This symbolic flexibility allowed memory to survive. When later cultures encountered Sumerian texts, they inherited not only the content, but the uncertainty. Akkadian scribes struggled with Sumerian grammar. Babylonian priests debated interpretations of ancient hymns. Assyrian scholars copied texts whose meanings were already obscure. They did not discard them. This persistence across cultures suggests that Sumerian knowledge was perceived as foundational, even when it was not fully understood. That perception did not arise accidentally. Civilizations do not preserve texts for thousands of years unless they believe those texts matter. Effort of that scale requires conviction. The conviction surrounding Sumerian texts implies that later peoples believed something essential lay within them. Perhaps they sensed what we now sense, that these tablets are not merely records of daily life, but windows into a worldview shaped by loss. This worldview does not fit comfortably into modern narratives of progress. It challenges linear assumptions. It invites cyclical thinking. It suggests that humanity may have risen, fallen, and risen again. Such ideas are often dismissed as speculative. Yet the archaeological record increasingly supports non-linearity. Periods of complexity followed by collapse. Knowledge lost and later rediscovered. Technologies forgotten and reinvented. The history of iron working alone demonstrates this. After the Bronze Age collapse, iron metallurgy regressed in some regions. Skills were lost. It took centuries to recover. Written records vanished. Trade networks disintegrated. If such regression occurred in a relatively recent and well-documented era, it could certainly have occurred earlier, leaving far fewer traces. The Sumerians lived close enough to such a regression to remember its shape. Their flood myths may compress centuries of disruption into a single event. Their long-lived kings may encode eras rather than individuals. Their divine teachers may preserve memory of leaders or specialists whose roles were essential. These interpretations do not require abandoning rational inquiry. They require adjusting scale. Human history spans far longer than our surviving records. Writing captures only a narrow slice. Before it, everything depends on transmission. Transmission distorts, but it also preserves. The Sumerians appear to sit at the boundary between loss and recovery. They inherited enough to rebuild, but not enough to explain everything. This position produces a culture that is both confident and cautious. Confident in systems that work. Cautious about claims of novelty. Their humility contrasts sharply with later narratives that emphasize mastery over nature. This contrast may reflect experience. A society that has seen nature overwhelm human effort will not assume dominance easily. It will seek alignment instead. The Sumerians aligned themselves with rivers, seasons, and stars. They read signs rather than impose will. They adapted rather than conquered. This does not mean they were passive. It means they were attentive. Attention is another form of technology. Attention leaves few artifacts. It leaves patterns. Those patterns appear in Sumerian culture with remarkable clarity. Their city planning follows environmental logic. Their calendars track celestial cycles accurately. Their rituals align with seasonal change. Their myths encode environmental thresholds. This coherence suggests long observation. Long observation requires stability across generations. If earlier societies existed that provided such stability, their disappearance would not erase the patterns they identified. Those patterns could survive in practice, even if their discoverers were forgotten. This may be what the Sumerians inherited. Not machines, not monuments. Patterns. Patterns of time. Patterns of land use. Patterns of social organization. Patterns survive collapse better than structures. The Sumerians preserved patterns in clay. That act transformed fragile memory into durable record. From that point forward, forgetting slowed. Civilization gained inertia. The question of whether the Sumerians recorded the true origin of humanity may never be answered definitively. But perhaps that is not the right question. A better question may be this. Did the Sumerians record the moment when humanity realized that memory itself must be protected? If so, then their tablets mark not the beginning of history, but the beginning of historical awareness. The awareness that worlds end. The awareness that knowledge can be lost. The awareness that preservation is a responsibility. This awareness may be the most important inheritance of all. We often imagine the past as naive. The Sumerians were not naive. They were cautious, reflective, and deeply aware of fragility. Their writing does not proclaim certainty. It records responsibility. That responsibility has been passed down, imperfectly, through every culture that followed. Each time we excavate a tablet, each time we translate a line, each time we reconsider an assumption, we participate in the same act. We are not discovering something new. We are restoring memory. And perhaps that is exactly what the Sumerians hoped would happen. Restoration, rather than discovery, may be the quiet theme running beneath everything the Sumerians left behind. When we look closely, even their idea of wisdom reflects this. Wisdom is not insight gained through sudden revelation. It is alignment with patterns that already exist. The wise person listens, observes, remembers, acts within limits. Wisdom is conservative in the deepest sense, not politically, but structurally. This definition contrasts with modern assumptions that intelligence is primarily creative or disruptive. In the Sumerian worldview, intelligence is preservative. It keeps things from breaking. That mindset makes sense in a world shaped by disruption. If earlier societies collapsed catastrophically, then intelligence would be measured by survival, not novelty. Those who understood how to maintain balance would be remembered. Those who pushed too far would be forgotten, except perhaps as warnings. Sumerian literature contains many such warnings. Hubris invites disaster. Disregard for limits angers the gods. Excess noise, excess growth, excess ambition destabilizes the system. These are not moralistic tales in the later sense. They are system-level cautions. This worldview feels strikingly relevant today. Modern civilization is built on expansion. Growth is assumed to be good. Innovation is celebrated regardless of consequence. Systems are pushed to their limits repeatedly. When failures occur, they are often framed as anomalies rather than signals. The Sumerians would likely recognize this pattern. They would see echoes of stories they had already told. This resonance may be one reason their civilization continues to captivate us. Their concerns feel contemporary because they are perennial. They were not asking where humanity came from in a biological sense. They were asking how humanity survives its own complexity. That question may be more fundamental. If humanity had already reached high levels of organization before the Sumerians, and if those societies collapsed, then the lesson left behind would not be technological. It would be ethical and structural. Do not overload systems. Do not forget the rhythms of the world. Do not assume permanence. The Sumerians encoded these lessons into everything. Their gods enforce balance. Their floods reset excess. Their heroes fail when they seek too much. Their kings rule only as long as order holds. This is not accidental consistency. It is worldview. Worldviews are not invented overnight. They form through long experience. The question of advanced ancient technology often captures imagination. But technology is only one expression of capability. A society may be advanced in organization, observation, and restraint, without leaving behind machines that impress modern sensibilities. Indeed, restraint may be the hardest capability to preserve. A society that learns restraint through catastrophe may encode it deeply. It may shape myth, law, and ritual around it. It may treat disruption not as progress, but as danger. Sumerian culture reflects such encoding. Their myths do not glorify rebellion. When gods rebel, consequences follow. When humans challenge limits, disaster results. Order must be negotiated carefully. This perspective could be read as oppressive. It could also be read as realistic. If earlier societies failed due to overreach, then restraint would become sacred. This framing does not eliminate the possibility of lost ancient knowledge. It reframes its nature. Knowledge may not have been about domination of nature, but about integration with it. Such knowledge leaves fewer traces. Stone tools survive. Metal survives. Equations survive. Social wisdom rarely does. Yet social wisdom may matter most. The Sumerians preserved social wisdom obsessively. Their legal codes, though complex, emphasize restitution over punishment. Their economic texts track fairness. Their religious rituals reinforce communal responsibility. This focus suggests awareness that social breakdown is as dangerous as environmental collapse. If earlier societies fragmented internally before collapsing externally, this lesson would be painful and memorable. Thus, the Sumerians may represent a synthesis. They combine inherited abstract knowledge with newly emphasized social stability. They rebuild civilization not by expanding outward, but by reinforcing inward. This inward reinforcement allows their systems to endure. Their influence persists not because they conquered widely, but because their frameworks worked. Later cultures adopted them because they provided stability. This is a quiet form of success. The Sumerians did not dominate history through force. They shaped it through structure. If we step back, the title question shifts subtly. What if the Sumerians recorded the true origin of humanity? Perhaps the answer is not that they recorded the moment humans first appeared. Perhaps they recorded the moment humanity learned from loss. That learning may be the true origin of civilization as we know it. Before that moment, humans lived, innovated, and adapted. After that moment, humans remembered deliberately. Memory changes everything. With memory, knowledge accumulates. Patterns are recognized. Mistakes are avoided more reliably. Civilization becomes possible on a larger scale. If earlier societies lacked durable memory systems, they would rise and fall repeatedly. Each collapse would erase progress. The Sumerians broke that cycle. By committing memory to clay, they slowed forgetting. Not completely, but enough. From that point forward, collapse no longer meant total erasure. Knowledge could be rediscovered. Systems could be rebuilt. In this sense, the Sumerians did not record the origin of humanity. They recorded the origin of continuity. That distinction reframes the debate between mainstream archaeology and alternative perspectives. The question is not whether humanity was capable of complexity earlier. It almost certainly was. The question is why that complexity did not persist. The answer may lie in memory. Without durable memory, civilizations are fragile. With it, they gain resilience. The Sumerians understood this instinctively. Their tablets are not monuments to greatness. They are safeguards against disappearance. Every wedge pressed into clay is an act of defiance against erasure. When we read them today, we participate in that defiance. We restore what was almost lost. We acknowledge uncertainty without dismissing possibility. We accept that our timelines are provisional. And we allow the past to remain complex. As we move toward the closing of this long exploration, the image that remains is simple. A person sits with wet clay. They hold a reed stylus. They press marks deliberately. They do not know who will read them. They do not know how the world will change. They only know that something matters enough to be preserved. That impulse links them to us. Whatever existed before the Sumerians, whatever was lost, whatever survived imperfectly, that impulse remains. It is the impulse to remember. It may be the most human origin story of all. The impulse to remember may be the quiet thread that binds every chapter of human history together. Long before we had writing, memory lived in people, in voices, gestures, repeated actions, and shared stories. That form of memory is powerful, but it is fragile. It depends on continuity. It depends on generations remaining connected. When that chain breaks, memory fragments. The Sumerians appear at the moment when that fragility became unacceptable. They lived in a landscape that reminded them daily of impermanence. Rivers shifted. Fields flooded. Cities rose and fell within lifetimes. Nothing felt guaranteed. In such a world, memory could not be trusted to chance alone. Writing changed that. But writing did not emerge as an act of confidence. It emerged as an act of concern. The earliest tablets do not celebrate identity. They track responsibility. Who owes what? Who received which rations? Who worked which fields? These are the foundations of continuity. They prevent disputes. They stabilize relationships. They keep communities functioning when memory falters. This emphasis reveals priorities shaped by experience. A society that has never known collapse might take continuity for granted. A society that has known it will work tirelessly to prevent its return. The Sumerians worked tirelessly. They organized knowledge into categories. They classified the world: animals, plants, professions, materials. This cataloging impulse reflects a desire to hold the world still long enough to understand it. Classification is a response to uncertainty. Their myths also classify. Gods have domains. Roles are assigned. Responsibilities are distributed. Nothing is left undefined. Even chaos has a place. This ordering instinct suggests that the Sumerians believed disorder was the real threat. That belief would make sense if disorder had already proven devastating. When later cultures inherited Sumerian systems, they inherited this instinct as well. Mesopotamian civilization became known for its bureaucracy, its record-keeping, its legal frameworks. These traits are often viewed negatively today, as rigid or impersonal. But rigidity can be protective. Rigid systems resist collapse better than flexible ones when stress is extreme. This may explain why Sumerian influence persisted even as political power shifted. Empires rose and fell, but the underlying administrative logic endured. Writing systems evolved. Languages changed. But the core structures remained recognizable. That durability is rare. It suggests that the Sumerian approach addressed something fundamental about human organization. If earlier societies existed that failed to achieve this durability, their disappearance would reinforce the value of preservation. This brings us back to the question of origins. Modern debates often frame origins as beginnings. First tools, first cities, first writing, first agriculture. But these markers may obscure deeper processes. Origins may be less about invention and more about stabilization. Humans may have experimented with complexity many times before it stuck. The Sumerians may represent the point at which complexity became self-sustaining. That does not diminish earlier achievements. It contextualizes them. A fire can be discovered many times, but only when it is controlled does it transform society. Complexity without continuity is fleeting. Continuity requires memory. Memory requires structure. Structure requires intention. The Sumerians provided all three. Their tablets are not dramatic. They do not tell us everything. They do not resolve every mystery, but they endure. They endure because they were designed to. When we ask whether the Sumerians recorded the true origin of humanity, we may be asking the wrong kind of question. They may not tell us where humanity began. They may tell us when humanity learned to endure. That lesson matters now as much as it did then. We live in a world of immense complexity. Systems are interconnected. Disruption travels quickly. Memory is abundant, but scattered. Information persists, but meaning fragments. In this sense, we share something with the Sumerians. We stand at a point where continuity feels uncertain. Their response was not to assert certainty, but to preserve what they could. They did not pretend to know everything. They wrote anyway. They did not eliminate ambiguity. They recorded it. They did not claim perfection. They emphasized responsibility. Their posture allowed their culture to echo across millennia. Perhaps the greatest mistake we can make is assuming that the past must fit neatly into our categories. The Sumerians resist that. They occupy a space between memory and myth, between loss and reconstruction, between certainty and possibility. They invite us not to conclude, but to consider. What if the earliest writing was not an announcement of arrival, but a quiet act of survival? What if civilization did not begin with confidence, but with caution? What if the true origin of humanity, as the Sumerians understood it, was the moment we chose to remember deliberately? Not everything can be saved, but something can. And sometimes that is enough. If something can be saved, then the act of saving becomes an ethical choice. The Sumerians appear to have understood this in a way that feels strikingly modern. They did not believe that memory preserved itself automatically. They believed it required effort, discipline, and intention. Knowledge left unattended would decay. Systems left unmaintained would fail. Order left unrenewed would dissolve. This belief shaped their sense of duty. Scribes were not merely record keepers. They were custodians. Their role carried weight. Accuracy mattered. Errors were corrected. Texts were copied again and again, not because they were entertaining, but because they were essential. This careful repetition is not a sign of intellectual stagnation. It is a sign of awareness. Awareness that loss is permanent and recovery is uncertain. If earlier worlds had vanished, then forgetting was the greatest threat of all. This may explain why Sumerian culture does not celebrate genius in the modern sense. There are no lone inventors, no sudden breakthroughs attributed to individuals. Progress, when it occurs, is collective, anonymous, embedded in tradition. This anonymity suggests that the Sumerians did not trust novelty to save them. They trusted continuity. Their gods reflect this trust. Divine authority does not belong to a single figure. It is distributed, balanced, checked, counsels deliberate, decisions are weighed, consequences are acknowledged. This distributed power structure mirrors practical governance. It suggests an inherited understanding that centralized authority is brittle. If earlier societies collapsed under concentrated power, this lesson would endure. The Sumerians encoded restraint into their myths so deeply that later cultures mistook it for theology rather than experience. Yet experience leaves fingerprints. Those fingerprints appear in how Sumerian texts speak about the future. They do not promise endless improvement. They warn of decline. They expect cycles. They assume that order must be constantly defended. This assumption is not pessimistic. It is realistic. Civilizations are not permanent. They persist only as long as effort continues. The Sumerians accepted this. Their writing does not ask to be admired. It asks to be remembered. This request has been honored in an uneven way. Much has been lost. Tablets broken. Archives burned. Languages forgotten. Yet enough survived to whisper across time. Those whispers do not give us answers. They give us posture. They tell us how the Sumerians stood in relation to their past. With humility, with caution, with respect. They believed they were standing on ruins. Whether those ruins belonged to a technologically advanced civilization, a socially complex one, or simply a long-forgotten network of human experience, may remain unresolved. The evidence allows multiple interpretations, and perhaps that openness is appropriate. The Sumerians themselves did not close the question. They did not say, "This is exactly how it was." They said, "This is what we remember." Memory is never complete. It is shaped by survival. If the Sumerians recorded the true origin of humanity, it may not be an origin we expect. Not the first tool. Not the first word. Not the first city. It may be the first time humanity chose to defend memory against erasure. That choice changed everything. From that moment on, collapse no longer meant total silence. Something could survive. Something could be restored. The Sumerians called this restoration. They saw themselves not as founders, but as caretakers. Not as creators, but as inheritors. This self-understanding may be their greatest contribution. It reminds us that we are never starting from nothing. We are always receiving fragments, interpreting them, preserving some, losing others. Our responsibility is not to claim certainty, but to carry forward what matters. As the wind moves across the ruins of southern Mesopotamia, it carries dust from walls that once held entire worlds. Beneath that dust, clay tablets still wait. Thousands remain unexcavated. Thousands more may never be found. What they contain may not overturn history, but they may continue to unsettle it. They remind us that history is not finished, that the past is deeper than our timelines. That certainty is often a luxury of distance. and they leave us with a quiet possibility that the first people to write did not believe they were beginning something new. They believed they were saving something old, and perhaps that belief, more than any single discovery, is the true inheritance they left behind. When we stand at the edge of this story, it becomes clear that the Sumerians were not trying to persuade anyone of a single truth. They were not arguing for belief. They were not constructing doctrine. They were recording continuity in a world where continuity could not be assumed. That distinction matters. Modern debates about ancient history often become polarized because we expect the past to provide certainty. We want definitive answers. Dates, origins, clear lines of cause and effect. But the Sumerians did not think this way. Their world had already shown them that certainty was fragile. Instead, they focused on what would endure. They preserved what worked. They recorded what aligned human life with the rhythms of land and sky. They passed down structures that maintained balance. Where explanation failed, they relied on tradition. Where memory blurred, they relied on repetition. This is why their civilization feels simultaneously advanced and restrained. They did not chase endless expansion. They did not frame history as upward progress. They accepted limits. That acceptance may be the most radical idea they left behind. If earlier societies existed and were lost, then the lesson would not be how to surpass nature, but how to live within it. How to recognize thresholds. How to avoid repeating mistakes that once proved catastrophic. The Sumerians encoded those lessons quietly. They did not say, "A great civilization existed before us, and it was destroyed." They said, "From distant days, this knowledge is being practiced." They did not say, "We invented this." They said, "It was given." That language leaves room for possibility without demanding belief. It allows multiple interpretations to coexist. Inheritance from earlier human cultures. Knowledge preserved through oral tradition. Memory compressed by catastrophe. Myth as survival mechanism rather than fantasy. All of these can be true at once. This openness is uncomfortable for rigid models of history, but it may be closer to reality. Human history is not a straight road. It is a braided river. Streams converge, separate, disappear underground, and re-emerge miles later. What we see at the surface is shaped by what survived below. The Sumerians lived where several of those streams resurfaced. They gathered fragments. They assembled systems. They stabilized memory long enough for civilization to persist beyond a single rise and fall. That achievement does not require lost machines or forgotten empires to be meaningful, but it does not exclude them either. What it requires is humility. The humility to admit that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The humility to recognize that archaeology reveals what survives, not everything that existed. The humility to listen to ancient voices without forcing them into modern categories. Mainstream archaeology has given us extraordinary insight into the past, but it is still a young discipline. Its models evolve. Its timelines expand. Its assumptions shift with each unexpected discovery. Sites like Göbekli Tepe did not overthrow archaeology. They refined it. They reminded us that certainty should always be provisional. The Sumerians would have understood this instinctively. They lived with provisional certainty. They acted as though the world could change abruptly, because it had. They behaved as though knowledge could vanish, because it had. They wrote as though memory needed protection, because it did. In doing so, they left behind something rare. Not a declaration of origin, but a record of responsibility. They did not ask future generations to worship them. They asked them to remember. That request has echoed across 5,000 years. Every time a tablet is translated, every time an assumption is reconsidered, every time a question is reopened rather than closed. The Sumerians did not give us answers. They gave us a posture toward the past, a posture that accepts uncertainty, that respects inheritance, that allows for possibilities beyond accepted narratives without demanding replacement myths. They remind us that history is not something we finish. It is something we revisit, and perhaps that is the most important thing they were trying to preserve. As this long journey comes to rest, there is no final revelation waiting at the end, no single conclusion that resolves every question. That absence is not a failure. It is faithful to the material. The Sumerians themselves did not resolve their deepest questions. They lived with them. They recorded them. They allowed them to remain open. They knew they were rebuilding on ruins. They knew some knowledge had been lost forever. They knew other fragments might resurface in unexpected ways. They accepted that reality and worked within it. That acceptance did not make them passive. It made them careful. Careful enough to invent writing not as a monument to themselves, but as a safeguard against forgetting. Careful enough to preserve systems rather than celebrate innovation. Careful enough to record memory even when its meaning was incomplete. If the Sumerians recorded the true origin of humanity, it may not be an origin we recognize easily. It may not be about the first humans, or the first cities, or the first tools. It may be about the moment humanity realized that survival depends not only on intelligence, but on remembrance. The moment when humans chose to protect memory deliberately, knowing that without it, everything could vanish again. That choice echoes into the present. We still build archives. We still argue about origins. We still resist the idea that our understanding might be provisional. We still struggle between certainty and possibility. In this sense, we are not so different from the scribes who pressed wedges into wet clay under the Mesopotamian sun. They did not know who would read their words. They did not know how history would judge them. They only knew that something mattered enough to preserve. That impulse crosses time intact. Whatever existed before the Sumerians, whatever was lost, whatever survived imperfectly, that impulse remains. It is the impulse to remember, even when certainty is impossible. And perhaps that, more than any single discovery, is the quiet truth the Sumerians left behind. When all of this is taken together, the Sumerian legacy begins to feel less like an answer and more like an invitation. An invitation to slow down when thinking about the past. An invitation to resist neat conclusions. An invitation to accept that human history may be older, deeper, and more fragile than any single model can contain. The Sumerians never insisted that their memories be accepted as literal fact. They did not demand belief. They did not build monuments proclaiming absolute truth. They wrote quietly, methodically, almost cautiously, as if aware that certainty itself could be dangerous. What they preserved was not a claim, but a continuity. They preserved the idea that knowledge could be carried forward even when its origin was no longer visible. That meaning could survive even when explanation was lost. That humanity could rebuild, again and again, without fully understanding how many times it had already done so. This way of thinking stands in contrast to the modern urge to declare final answers, to draw bold lines on timelines, to say, this is where it began, and nowhere else. The Sumerians do not say that. They say, from distant days. Those 3 words may be the most honest description of deep history we possess. From distant days means beyond memory, but not beyond consequence. From distant days means inherited, not invented. From distant days means something survived long enough to matter. Whether that something was a previous civilization, a long observational tradition, a body of social knowledge, or a synthesis of many lost experiences, the Sumerians treated it with respect. They did not claim ownership of it. They acted as caretakers. That attitude may be the most reliable signal we have that they were dealing with something older than themselves. Civilizations that invent tend to celebrate. Civilizations that inherit tend to preserve. The Sumerians preserved. They preserved timekeeping precise enough that we still use it. They preserved mathematical relationships elegant enough to endure millennia. They preserved stories structured enough to carry memory across catastrophe. They preserved language long after it stopped being spoken because it still mattered. They preserved uncertainty. And in doing so, they left space for future generations to think, question, and reinterpret. This space is where we stand now. We do not have to accept every interpretation. We do not have to reject mainstream archaeology or replace it with new dogma. We do not have to decide, once and for all, what existed before Sumer. What we can do is acknowledge that the past is not closed, that our understanding is provisional, that new discoveries will continue to reshape timelines, that some knowledge may be permanently lost, that other knowledge may surface in unexpected ways. The Sumerians lived comfortably with this openness. They knew the world could change abruptly. They knew memory could fracture. They knew certainty could dissolve. And still they wrote. They wrote because writing slows forgetting. They wrote because preservation matters even when meaning fades. They wrote because something was worth carrying forward, even if it could not be fully explained. That is not the mindset of mythmakers inventing stories. It is the mindset of survivors documenting what remains. Perhaps that is the quiet reason their tablets still speak to us. Not because they shout truth, but because they whisper continuity. They remind us that human history may not be a straight ascent from ignorance to knowledge, but a long process of remembering, losing, and remembering again. They remind us that what survives is not always what was greatest, but what was cared for. And they remind us that the act of remembering, in itself, is a form of wisdom. So when we ask, what if the Sumerians recorded the true origin of humanity, we might finally understand the question differently. What if the origin they recorded was not the first moment of human existence, but the first moment humans chose to guard memory against extinction? What if civilization did not truly begin with cities or writing or kingship, but with the decision to preserve knowledge deliberately, knowing how easily it could vanish? If that is the case, then the Sumerians were not at the beginning of humanity. They were at the beginning of continuity. And perhaps that is why their words still reach us across 5,000 years of silence, carried not by certainty, but by care. As this long reflection comes gently to rest, one thought lingers above all others. The Sumerians never told us exactly what came before them. They did not give us diagrams of lost worlds or timelines carved in stone. They left us something quieter, and perhaps more honest. They left us the evidence of people who knew that memory could fail, and who chose to protect what they could before it did. They wrote as if they were standing after an ending, not at a beginning. They wrote with restraint rather than certainty, with reverence rather than triumph. They recorded systems that worked, patterns that endured, and stories that carried meaning even when their original context had faded. Whether those patterns came from an earlier civilization, from long observation, from inherited knowledge passed through generations, or from experiences humanity no longer remembers clearly, the Sumerians treated them as something precious. They did not claim to be the first. They claimed to be the ones who remembered. That distinction changes how we read the clay. The tablets do not demand belief. They invite reflection. They ask us to consider that human history may be deeper than our timelines, more fragile than our models, and more cyclical than we are comfortable admitting. They remind us that knowledge does not always arrive through invention. Sometimes it arrives through survival. Sometimes the most important act a civilization can perform is not to create something new, but to carry something forward. The Sumerians carried memory across a rupture we can still see traces of today. Flooded layers in the earth. Sudden complexity in the record. A language without relatives. A worldview shaped by caution, balance, and restoration. They preserved what they could, knowing it would never be complete. And now, thousands of years later, we find ourselves doing the same thing. Piecing together fragments. Revising assumptions. Accepting uncertainty. Listening carefully to voices that understood how easily everything could be lost. Perhaps that is the quiet continuity between them and us. Not certainty, not final answers, but the shared responsibility to remember, even when we do not fully understand what we are remembering. In that sense, the Sumerians may not have recorded the origin of humanity as a species. They may have recorded the moment humanity chose not to forget itself. And that choice, pressed into clay beneath an ancient sun, still waits patiently for us to listen.